We've been married for almost 7 years, and Silas has been frozen for 10. So really, when you look at God's sovereignty, he had chosen for Silas to be our baby before we ever even met. And so that still gives me goosebumps to this day, and how God's love and redemption really was working out even before Jenni and I ever met.
You're listening to the Great Reassessment Podcast.
Today, we have a heartwarming episode, one that brings my heart a lot of joy, because I'm interviewing two of my best friends today over the topic of embryo adoption. So that might be news to a lot of people, but I just want to introduce Randy and Jenni Paul and their son, Silas. How's it going, guys?
Good. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about how old is Silas?
He is turning 13 months tomorrow.
He's gotten
Yes.
so big.
I know. He's not really quite sure what we're doing right now.
Yeah, no, this is not his first podcast appearance, I've been told.
No, when he was 7 months old, we did another podcast with the National Embryo Donation Center through the Embryo Donation podcast.
Yeah, well, he's used to the
Or
camera.
Embryo Adoption podcast, I mean.
Looks like he's used to being in front of a camera. He's just kind of, showing us his angles. He's a handsome young man. Well, let's just get right into the story, really, because it really is fascinating. So,
He's so cute.
About Silas and how the Lord brought him into the world and how he used you guys to be his parents. And it's a fascinating story. So I don't know where you guys like to start, but I'll let you guys just kind of take the wheel.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think we should start at the beginning. So, Randy and I, we've been married almost 7 years. And after about 2 years of being married, we tried to have children. And so we were not able to have children. So we tried for a year and we weren't able to get pregnant. And then at that point, we went to a fertility clinic and we got tested to see if there was anything wrong with our anatomy or hormones and things like that. But everything came back pretty much normal. We decided to just keep trying for another year. And we still were not able to achieve pregnancy after 2 years of trying. So then we ended up actually trying a fertility procedure called IUI, which stands for intrauterine insemination. And so basically that is injecting Randy's sperm into my uterus at the time of ovulation. And so we did that twice, and that still didn't result in pregnancy. And even before we tried that, we had decided, like, if this doesn't work, we would look into either doing IVF or adoption. And so when that didn't work, when we weren't able to achieve pregnancy, then we looked into both of those options. And I think through like talking to nurses and doctors at fertility clinics, doing our own research, and then we also were listening to a podcast called The Briefing by Dr. Albert Mohler, and he happened to be talking a lot about IVF and the ethics and morals behind IVF and also embryo adoption. And so we decided not to do IVF after thinking about it. It just didn't sit right with us, with our own convictions. And so then we looked at adoption, and we looked at all different types of adoption. Embryo adoption actually wasn't our first choice that we looked into. Because I think still at that point, if, like, I was thinking, why would we do embryo adoption when we could do IVF? Like, you have to go through a lot of the same medical procedures. But in the end, we ended up doing embryo adoption. And that was so we finally, I think around 2.5 years of trying, we applied to do embryo adoption. And then about the 3-year mark of trying is when we actually did the embryo transfer.
Well, thanks for sharing that, Jenni. I want to backtrack a little bit about, as you guys were going through that journey of trying to get pregnant, you got married and you want to start a family. Were there what was that like? Was that hard? Was that difficult? Like what what do you think you guys learned through that entire process?
Well, I think it was absolutely difficult because, every couple, desires usually to have a baby, and I think it's usually portrayed that it's going to happen very easy and very, very quick. And so I think anytime people encounter any kind of obstacles to that process, it's difficult. And honestly, infertility has a very wide spectrum of infertility. And so, for example, we were in the boat where we just never conceived. We had never had a point where we had a positive pregnancy test or any of that after multiple different, ways to try to do that. And but some couples will conceive and then they can't carry that baby. They'll have miscarriages, or some couples will have pregnancies that go much farther into the pregnancy and still unfortunately lose viability. And so all of those are covered under infertility. And so there is a wide spectrum, and everyone is difficult and very even difficult in their own way. So it is a hard journey when you start going through it, and you're seeing that, okay, not, things aren't happening the way we would want. And so I think for us, again, as Christians, we had to walk through that process of trusting that, and learning that it's God who opens and closes the womb. He's the one who brings life when he calls life to be. And that's still hard though to wrestle with, because we know that the desire to have kids is a very good desire. It's not a wrong desire to have kids. And so, but what we had to learn was that the desire for kids and that hope to want to have kids of our own does not trump the desire to honor Christ with our life, and to know that we had to learn, and it's easy to say now, but walking through it was hard. But we had to learn that our greatest hope in life was ultimately actually not in a baby. Our greatest hope in life is our salvation in Christ, and that we are God's children. And so, thankfully, we had, the church around us to really help to point us to look to Christ through that. And we had to really walk through that. Another passage that is really commonly quoted is Romans 8:28, that talks about that, for we know that all things God works for good for those who are loved by God and called according to his purpose. And I think most people, especially Christians, understand that, that all includes the struggles and difficult things in life. But I think a lot of times people don't continue into the next verses that say that that good that he is bringing about through all those things is being conformed into the image of his son. And so we've had to learn that, not having a baby and going through this infertility, God was actually using this struggle to help us to be more conformed into Christ's image. And so we had to trust that and learn to allow him to do that work in us. And so no, it's not easy at all. But thankfully we got, again, God supported us and equipped us with people to help us to learn these things. And so now, our hope is that through our story and through the difficulties that we've uh, encountered through this, that it can be now an encouragement for other people who may be going through it. And so that's really our passion now, is to educate people, to help people to look at these things and to think rightly about them, and hopefully make decisions that are going to be honoring to the Lord.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. So let's get into that story a little bit. So you guys start to learn about embryo adoption. And so could you, before we go further, give
Yes.
like just a working definition of what embryo adoption is, and then we'll get into sort of distinguishing that from IVF. But like, what is embryo adoption?
Yeah, you can go
I'll,
for
I'll
it.
start. I think first we got to have a proper definition of what an embryo is, because I think people don't understand what an embryo is. And so, this isn't just when we talk about life at the very beginning of human life, this isn't just a Christian conviction. It's actually science and biology supports it. So we have to understand that an embryo is the earliest stage of human life. But an embryo is created from an egg and a sperm, which, when our reproductive cells go through meiosis, they separate into two halves of the chromosomes that make a human. So an egg is half of the genetic material for a human, and a sperm is half the genetic material of a human. And so they are not a human in and of themselves. It's at the point when the egg and the sperm are fertilized that those come together to create an embryo, which is the two pairs of chromosomes. And then that's actually at the beginning of human life. So when we're talking about embryo adoption, we're talking about these eggs that have been fertilized and now are in that embryo early stage of life.
Okay. So yeah, an embryo is the first spark of humanness, right? And and that happens in the womb, right? It reminds me of, Psalm 139, you knitted me together in my mother's womb. And so thank you for that clarification. So, for those who believe in the sanctity of life, it would be consistent to say that, at conception is when an embryo is formed, and that is the beginning of when these two components become a person. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Exactly.
Yeah.
And
I
so
would say like at the moment of fertilization.
fertilization. Okay.
Yeah, because sometimes conception could mean like the implantation, but it's actually the moment of fertilization when the sperm and egg come together.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good clarification. Um, so then what is embryo adoption after, having that definition?
Um, so to kind of explain embryo adoption, I do need to talk a little bit about IVF. So I'll try to do it in a
Yeah, because
concise.
I know there's some tension there that has to be reconciled with. So yeah, whatever you need to, say to describe it, please do.
Okay. So um, embryo adoption happens because when couples go through IVF, which stands for in vitro fertilization. So that process Randy just talked about, the egg and the sperm coming together to make embryos. These are made outside of the body in like a petri dish or some kind of dish in a laboratory. So when couples go through IVF to make their own children, what happens often is couples will make around 10 embryos. Some are less, some are more, but on average, if you look it up, most couples make about 10 embryos. And then this couple will usually transfer some to the mom, and the mom might give birth to hopefully as many as they can. But say the mom only gives birth to like 4 of these embryos, which is actually really a good success rate. Um, but then they might have like 6 left, and then they have to decide what to do with these extra embryos that they made. So their options are there's usually only 4 options. There is just keep your embryos frozen indefinitely. The other option is you can thaw the embryos out. So they're frozen, then you thaw them, which means they die in that process. The third option is donating the embryos to science. So even if you're donating it to science, those embryos do not live after, I think the cutoff is 2 weeks, is the point where they don't do any more research to embryos. And then the fourth option, which is less common, is donating embryos for adoption for another couple to have. And so that fourth option is what we did. We adopted someone else's embryos. So they're not at all our genetics, but we took them in as our own, and we ended up transferring 2 embryos from a different family, and then only one of them survived the pregnancy to birth.
So the implantation process of actually becoming pregnant is very similar between the two, but there's a wide difference in how the embryos, I guess the reason in which they're pursued. Maybe you could say that. So
Yeah, I think there's a big pull, like, to have your own genetic children. And there's actually nothing wrong with that desire. Like, God intended us to have children, between a husband and wife. But that desire to have children is so strong that I think, unfortunately, a lot of people go into IVF just in this desperation mode and just willing to do whatever it takes to have a baby. And unfortunately, in that process, many embryos that are created end up dying. I think roughly about only 5% of embryos that are ever made end up resulting in a baby being born. So the amount of death that is caused by IVF is overwhelmingly more prevalent than life.
So, and Randy, maybe you can touch on this point. Given like all the surplus embryos, do you know how many roughly are? Because Jenni, you were saying how a lot of them remain frozen. How many embryos are frozen? Maybe just about like in the United States. Is there a statistic for that?
They say there's roughly about 1 million embryos that are frozen and being stored currently in the United States.
Okay, and unless somebody or a couple like yourselves choose to adopt these embryos, they remain frozen indefinitely or eventually.
Or the couples will choose those other options. Like Jenni said, they can thaw them and discard them, or they can donate them to science frozen, and then they'll do whatever testing, scientific testing on them. But again, neither of those options lead to life. And so the only way these embryos have a chance at life is to be transferred to a viable uterus. So whether that be the couples who own it, the wife or the mom, or being donated to another couple who has a fertile uterus.
Okay. Well, I think that lays some helpful groundwork for people to understand sort of the landscape a little bit. Let's get back to your guys' story. So, as you guys are trying to grow your family, you're visiting other fertility clinics and you're exploring your options, so to speak. How did you arrive at embryo adoption?
Yeah, so we had a couple at our church who, an older couple whose daughter and son-in-law had also had infertility issues and had underwent embryo adoption through the same organization that we ended up going through about 10 or 11 years ago. And so when we were going through this process of infertility and trying to look into options, they had kindly told us about what their daughter had went through and the two boys that they had successfully through embryo adoption. And so that was the first time we had ever heard of it. When we had went to the fertility clinics to go through testing and look at options, embryo adoption was never put forth as an option for couples to get pregnant. And so had it not been for the couple at our church, we would have never even honestly known. It's not something that's very well advertised. And honestly, I think that the reason that fertility clinics don't usually put that forth as an option is because fertility clinics are a business. And so embryo adoption does not make them money unless they're the ones facilitating it. And so, IVF, even IUI are options fertility clinics provide themselves and do have a cost to them. And so that's something too that, with this IVF infertility business, couples, so IVF is typically, there's a rough range of how much it costs, but it per cycle, which means per, creation of embryos and then transfer embryos, it's about $20,000 to $30,000 per cycle. And so there have been many couples who have almost gone into bankruptcy trying to pursue this effort to have children through the process of IVF. IUI is a much cheaper option. It's in the few $100s per cycle. And that's usually where, again, couples start. And then after, again, a couple unsuccessful tries of that, then, IVF is usually the next step that's proposed to couples. And so, so again, we had thought of that. And again, we're doing research, but then, when embryo adoption was something that we understood, we definitely felt more led to that. Because when you think of this surplus of embryos in the United States, that there's roughly about 1 million embryos awaiting the chance at life. With IVF, so you could even go through IVF as a Christian couple and say, we desire to commit to every embryo that we make through the IVF process. Even with that, good desire, don't know ultimately if you will actually be able to commit to all those embryos. So there's a chance that you may have surplus embryos at some point that you will then have to decide what to do with. Um, and like Jenni had mentioned already, in the process of making embryos, some embryos are lost. And so there's still, even in the process of, say, you only make a few, there's still potentially loss of life in that process of making them. So for us, we were trying to look at, instead of being potentially in the position of having the responsibility of either making life that didn't make it initially, or having being a part of the surplus embryo group, we wanted to see, and it's well known that embryo adoption is more of a rescue mission for these embryos. These embryos were already made and are waiting, and so we now then are able to give those embryos the chance at life. And even the embryos that don't survive an embryo adoption process still had the best chance of life that it ever could have had. And so it's sad, we again, out of the two embryos that we adopted, only one, that Silas, made it through the full pregnancy. But even that other embryo, we grieve that loss of life. But instead of being frozen, so they were frozen for 10 years when we adopted them. That other embryo that didn't make it now is no longer frozen and was able to have the best chance that it had for life. So there's still a sweetness to that, even though it's still sad that the other embryo didn't make it.
Yeah, as you're speaking and describing that, like there's just like this redemptive quality in everything you're describing, right? Like to be a human, to be an image bearer, it undermines like the dignity that and the intrinsic value that a life has to just remain frozen. And then to even strip a human life of the dignity of dying, right? Like you're sort of just frozen here. And so it sort of is like putting like this natural order which God has weaved into the world like on pause and putting it in the hands of um man, which it's not where it's meant to be. And so um like we can grieve the loss, yet take rest in the fact that there is a redeeming quality, that this life is no longer on pause where it should not be. And so that's kind of just something that kind of came to my mind as you were saying that.
Mm-hmm.
So what was the actual process like? I know you had to travel and like you had to go back and forth to Knoxville, Tennessee. Is that right? Can you
Mm-hmm.
talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so when we decided to apply for embryo adoption, we went through an organization called the National Embryo Donation Center, based in Knoxville, Tennessee. And they're a Christian-based organization. They're very like pro-life. They're a Christian-based pro-life organization. And it's funny because I put my application in, and then I got a voicemail from them, and it's someone with a Southern accent. And I was like, oh wow, like this is a little different than being up here in Washington. But yeah, we had to travel there twice. The first time we traveled there was for my medical clearance to make sure I could actually um, be be healthy enough to carry a pregnancy. So they did a little bit of testing when I was there, and it was really fast procedure. Um, and then at that point, um, we needed to do a home study. This organization requires that um, you are deemed safe by the state or like a social worker that you could adopt children.
Which is the same process for any adoption. So they just want to keep that consistent with adoption. So
Yeah, and so we had just finished. So we actually started that home study before we traveled to Tennessee. I think we traveled the first time in May
Mhm.
3, and then our home study went through. So then we were able to start looking through donor profiles to find embryos. And basically that was just looking online on their database of different families who are wanting to put up their embryos for adoption. And you could see their pictures, if and like medical information and just like basic things about the family. And it's whatever they reported. So not every profile was completely like finished, but the very first profile we saw was actually the ones we ended up going with. And they put their embryos up for adoption the day before our medical clearance appointment. So they had been frozen for 10 years, but they had just been put up for adoption the day before we went there. So we reserved that family pretty quickly. And then I think after 2 weeks of like looking, we decided to go with them as our number one choice. And looking through those databases too, you could also see how many embryos each family had. And there was a variety. Some people just had one embryo and some people had like 17. And so there was a range. I mean, the 17 was an outlier, but like I did see a profile with 17 embryos. I'd say most had like four to five. And so we ended up going with the two that we adopted. And then we had another family, I guess you would say on reserve in case when we thawed out the embryos, they died. Because that's common too. Like you can be frozen for a long time, but then when they thaw them out to transfer, they can also die in that process. So they always want to make sure you have at least 6 embryos on hand. But anyways, we passed the medical clearance. We found the family. We had to do a few other paperwork things. We wanted to have an open adoption so that our children could know their biological family. So that was some paperwork and back and forth.
Why?
And
Can I
then,
ask a question really quick
yeah.
about? I often hear, choosing between a closed and open adoption. Why
Mhm.
did you guys feel like it was necessary? And I know you said so they could know their bio, but is there any deeper reasons for why you guys chose the open adoption?
Yeah, so the National Embryo Donation Center is actually because there's other they're the largest organization to do facilitate embryo adoption. There are other organizations, but I think they're among the few that allow for a closed or anonymous donation and adoption process. So there are, couples or individuals who have embryos who may not want to have that communication in the future with the family that receives them, but they still want those embryos to have the chance at life. So they allow for those closed adoptions. But then, they also obviously allow for open adoptions. And open adoption too is we had to learn and understand that there's a spectrum again of open adoption to what's openness look like. So, it could be as open as these families that you're adopting from and the recipients, that they're constantly seeing each other, even in person potentially, and having a lot of communication with each other. But it could be as simple as like our open adoption is we send them, at the very least yearly updates of email and pictures, and we'll reach out if we need to, but we're not necessarily going to constantly be seeing them or stuff like that. So you kind of agree onto what that openness looks like, but the couple from church whose daughter went through this, we got the chance to talk with them a couple times and even go and meet their boys in person. And when we were talking to them about their story, they actually had chosen to go through the closed adoption route. And so we got to kind of learn what that was like for them. But for us, and this is something that the NEDC does in your education as well. There's modules on top of the social work home study that you do for just embryo adoption. But one of those things that they talk about is that we learn that it's important that um, over 80% of kids who are adopted um, by any means seek the desire to find their biological family at some point. It's a large majority of kids because there's something to finish the pieces of their story, and they want to learn more about that. And so even if you go through a closed adoption route, there's probably a good chance that your kid's going to want to know who their biological family is. And nowadays, with technology like 23andMe and Ancestry.com, where they can do, DNA genetic testing, even if you had a closed adoption, there's still a chance that you can still find out who your biological family are. So, what we learned and why we chose open adoption was that one, we wanted Silas to have the ability to have that knowledge of them already, and so that there wasn't going to be this desire later on that he's going to be like, oh, I really need to go find them. He already will know them from the beginning. And then also just the fact that, again, the chances are that even if we hadn't, he would have probably found them if he had gone through any kind of DNA thing like the 23andMe or anything like that in the future. So instead of having that be a question mark in the future, we just wanted to have that as part of their story. And in general, open adoptions typically are healthier for the kids who are adopted because of that reason, that they will know their story from the beginning and not have that missing piece.
Yeah, the idea of wanting to, I mean, I think people who aren't even adopted, have this desire to know about their origins, and so I think that's really cool. Um, it and but it just allows, Silas, or adopted children, to understand their own origin a little bit better and find where they fit in this story of life. And they have it. Silas has a really unique way in which he came into the world, and it sounds like it could help him lean into embracing his own uniqueness, the way God formed him and brought him into the world. And so I think that's really cool. But I wanted to hit that point because I think that was important, because people out there who are listening might be wondering, closed or open adoption.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, it's just, I want to share with that too. Like, at first, I was really wanting to do a closed adoption. I wanted to do that because I didn't want to deal with other families, and it can get really complicated. So if you're listening and you're like thinking about embryo adoption, being like, I don't want to do an open adoption, you don't have to. I think just the education we went through was enough to convince me that it was a good decision. But there's still embryos that are donated anonymously, and they still deserve a chance at life to continue their lives. So just know, like, that is a possibility if you're out there listening and are considering this.
Well, and one thing I want to touch on too with embryo adoption is that legally there's a different distinction for embryo adoption compared to a domestic infant adoption. And so technically, when you look at the law of what adoption law states, adoption law applies to babies who have been born. And so when you hear stories about couples who adopt a baby as an infant and then struggle sometimes with the rights to that child custody, and where maybe the birth mom may still want to have that baby back or things like that, that's under adoption law. And so embryo adoption is different though, because since these embryos by definition are not born yet, they are, and this may sound a little weird, but they are actually considered property of the couples who made them through IVF. And so when we talk about embryo adoption, the uniqueness to the legal side of it is that when we adopted these two embryos from the donor couple, what happened legally is that the rights of those embryos were transferred to us in that process. So that way, just like you would transfer the rights, like the deeds of a house, to somebody when you buy the house, so that once we implanted those embryos and then gave birth to Silas, he, from even before he was born, was legally our child, our name on the birth certificate. And so there's no chance that a donor couple could ever legally try to claim custody, even though they may be biologically connected to that child. It's not the same as adoption law. And so there's a uniqueness to that. And so in that process, when we were choosing, the actual legal side of embryo adoption, the legal agreement we have with the couple actually is more based off of the communication preferences that we would have with that donor couple through the Silas's 18 years of his life until he's an adult, not anything related to any custody or anything. And so and that's where again that idea of openness comes from. When if couples are pursuing that open embryo adoption, what you agree upon between you and the donor couples is how often are you going to talk, by what means are you going to have communication, how much are you going to share, and is there a possibility to meet in person at some point. So for example, with the donor family for Silas, we agreed upon a minimum of an email once a year with pictures and updates. We agreed that if anything came up medically on either our side with Silas or even with their family that was new that could be linked to each other, that we would let each other know. And then we also agreed that at least one time before Silas is 18, we will meet in person, to have the opportunity for their family to meet Silas and him to meet them. Um, and that's it. We can always do more than that, legally, but we can't do less, and we're bound to that legally. So I always wanted to share that because there is a difference when we talk about embryo adoption as far as the legal side of it. And that's something that we were educated on through the process of before we were ever allowed to start looking for couples. They have you go through these modules so that way you have that clear understanding.
Yeah, there's a lot to think about for sure. And it is sounds like there's a lot of similarities, but then there's also a lot of unique landscapes to sort of navigate as well. Um, and so was the actual implanting of the embryos, what was that like?
Right. So yeah, so we did the medical clearance in May 2023, and then in September is when we did the transfer in 2023. And we went back to Knoxville and did it there. And it was really, really cool. Probably one of the best experiences I've ever had. I think it was, well, I'll just tell you what happened, then I'll share like why it was important. But you go to the clinic and they get you prepped for the transfer. And also part of the prep is doing a lot of injections in the weeks preceding it. So I had gone through like, I don't know, 100 injections at that point or something.
You
And
you
then,
prepare your body the same way as you would for IVF. So actually, those embryo adoption and IVF, when it comes to the preparation and the transfer, it's is the exact same process.
so yeah, he did a good job with those injections. Um, but yeah, so they told us that both of our embryos that we adopted survived the thaw, and they both looked really good. They give them a grade, kind of like how good of quality they are, how well they think they will result in pregnancy, and they both received like the highest grading. And so they showed a picture of the embryos to us, and it's like under a microscope because these are like really tiny little human beings. You can't really see them without a microscope at this point. And so before they were frozen, they had been growing in this petri dish for about 6 days. So they're like 6-day-old embryos that had been frozen for 10 years, and now they're going to be put into my womb. And so, yeah, I mean, the procedure was actually pretty smooth. It took probably like 3 minutes. They just put the embryos inside of me. And Randy is an ultrasound technician. And so he actually helped the doctor guide the procedure, which was really special.
Wow,
And
that's
Randy's
awesome.
going to show you a picture of the embryos.
Wow.
So these are what an embryo looks like. And so under a microscope, there's nothing that you can distinctly say, and I don't know which one of these was Silas and which was the other embryo. There's no way for us to know, but this is what life at its beginning stage looks like,
Amazing.
when we talk about an embryo.
But yeah, I was like really emotional during that process. I think, trying to get pregnant for 3 years, and you finally are pregnant instantly, and like you can see it happen. I mean, you're not like technically pregnant until you get the positive pregnancy test, but it's still like you feel like you're pregnant
Mhm.
because you see the evidence. Like there's actually like little embryos put inside of you, and they're in you, and yeah. So it was a really sweet day for sure.
Wow. And then, yeah, I can't imagine. I mean, that's just such a unique experience. When you're the only people I know who have gone through embryo adoption, and I mean, it's a fascinating story. It really is. And so, um, obviously, you guys had Silas on here just at the very beginning. So praise the Lord, he was born. You carried him for 9 months, and he's here. What is that? How does your experience affect your love for him as like somebody who was rescued essentially, and his maybe you would say is like his gestational age is uh, almost 11 years, right? Like
Yeah.
well, I guess his time alive plus the time, like how does that shape your view of your son and your affection for him?
Well, I think the uniqueness to embryo adoption is that it's the only adoption in which you actually go through the pregnancy with the baby that you adopt. And so the one of the sweetest things about Silas is that we're able to bond with him, especially Jenny, through the whole pregnancy. And so that already adds to that care and love because you got to go through all that and then to give birth and be there. I mean, it was the most amazing thing to be able to be there when he was born and just know that now after being frozen for 10 years he's experiencing life and he's living it to the fullest now. He and and so it's just it's incredibly sweet and to know that we do grieve the fact that he was frozen, like that really life was never meant to be frozen. And so there's a sadness to this whole process where these embryos, so I get it often where people when we share his story or even talk about IVF, people are like, wow, that's such an amazing thing. And I always have to say it's like it's yes and no because yeah, it's amazing that a technology like that is even possible because for thousands of years it was never even possible or even considered that that would be a thing. But the sadness is that's really not the way it was meant to be, and the fact that there's a lot of again complications to it, and so that's one thing that I do want to make sure we touch on before we finish this podcast is that so one disclaimer I want to have for those listening as we hear and talk about the story and IVF and everything, especially as we start in this last bit talking about the ethics and morals, is that well, the first disclaimer I have is that our goal is never to shame any couple or individual who has pursued IVF, because most people are not given this a lot of this information or have gone into IVF having understood kind of all that goes into it. And so our goal is never to shame anyone who's gone through IVF, but we want to both, encourage and educate people, and especially those couples who have surplus embryos. It's our encouragement and challenge to those individuals to try to rightly think about these embryos, especially believing you have to have that foundational belief that they are life and deserve life. That if there are couples who have leftover embryos or know people who have couples with leftover embryos, our encouragement and challenge is that they would allow those embryos to have that chance of life. So if they are not able to do that themselves, then to consider the process of donating them to a recipient couple like ourselves who desire to have a baby and would love to. So that's the first disclaimer. The second disclaimer that I always want to share when we talk about this is that we assert that every life that is born through IVF is still d- earning of dignity and deserve celebrated as life, made in the image of God. And so it doesn't matter how life is made, life is still worth celebrated. And so the process of IVF, for example, we don't condone that for the sake of the fact that the life was made, but per se, but we do celebrate that life is made. So we never want to, again, shame any person who is born through IVF, and don't want to shame any couple who have pursued that themselves, and maybe in certain circumstances. So I always want to make sure that's really clear, because as we talk about these things, sometimes it can bring up, maybe a defensiveness in people, or that. And I just want to make sure that's really foundationally there as we pursue this idea of the ethical dilemma of IVF, the moral complications that come about when life is created artificially, and by the different means of assisted reproductive technology. So I just want to make sure that that was really clear. And our heart is not to shame or look down on those scenarios.
Yeah, I appreciate those disclaimers. There's so many couples out there who struggle and they anguish with the desire to have children, and you your heart goes out to people who really struggle and really they desire something that is so good. They desire a relationship that God has sort of put in us to desire, and it's this desire to start families and to have children. And there are certain people who are more equipped to deliver those messages, I think. Like, you guys have had a unique experience, a lot of education as it surrounds this field, where I think your testimony can be delivered in a tender way that recognizes the difficulty, because you've gone through it, and
Hmm.
but you've also seen sort of the darker side of IVF, I guess you could say, and the commodification and the market that it's created, and it's in, like you guys were saying, like, never once were you guys presented with embryo adoption as an alternative, but it was, there's a market and there's a way to make money doing this. So what would you say to somebody who is a blank slate and they're considering IVF, but they haven't necessarily, like, or they, embryo adoption, and they sort of see these two as the same. They don't necessarily see the moral risk with IVF, but they're really attached to the idea of, no, it's got to be my child, right? It's got to be like my genetics. And what would you
Hmm.
say to that person?
Yeah, I would think like your last question, like how do I love Silas? It kind of plays into this because I was really worried I wouldn't be able to love this adopted embryo baby. And it's crazy to me now because I love him with all my heart. But I was really worried because he wasn't my DNA. And I think that's a real thing that you can't just like get over it in a day. Like it took me like probably like I don't remember,
Several months.
several months to kind of like wrap my mind around I might never have my own biological child and this other baby I want, but will I be able to really love this baby? And so I think my first response to this person would be like, I totally understand. Like God put in us this desire to have our own children, be fruitful and multiply. Like IVF was it's kind of like this crazy reality we have now where we can kind of play God in a way and like make life. So I would just start with sympathizing with that, but also telling them like it once you have any adopted child, whether it's embryo adoption or domestic or international, like you will love this child so much and you won't even care. And it's really opened my heart even to other types of adoption too. And because I don't think we thought maybe like, oh, maybe one day we'll adopt, but I think a lot of people say that. But like doing this process really like grew my heart and love for like kids and just the need in the world for adoption. I forget your full question.
If somebody, was a blank slate and they were worried, and you sort of answered that the first part, but they're thinking about IVF and they don't necessarily see a difference between the two, or
I think another thing I would ask them to think about is, what do they believe about life? Because you have to start there. Like if you are, saying, I believe that life begins at fertilization or conception, then you really have to take that seriously. Because I think what happens in IVF, and even people who say they're pro-life, is they see this as a way to bring life. But like I mentioned, like only 5% of these embryos are born as babies. So it's hard to be pro-life and also support IVF. And also, one embryo does not equal a baby. When I went through like all the fertility stuff, I asked some questions, and one of the nurses talked to me and she's like, let's say you make 10 embryos. About 4 of them will die even before we have the chance to transfer them. And that was a very common scenario she was giving me. And so like, it'd be hard for me as someone who's pro-life, who values, who sees embryos as tiny image bearers, to be like, okay, I'm gonna make you knowing that you will die. So I think it's the intention there. Like, people miscarry, but you don't intentionally like make them knowing they'll die. So I would just warn them that it's a real risk, that you might make 4 embryos, but they could all die in that process. Like, and you don't know. Like, there's really like no way to avoid moral risk when you do IVF. Even if you are like, I'm gonna just do 1 embryo, like there's still risk there, and you can't really avoid that.
The other thing I also want to make sure that's clear is IVF is not inherently evil, but it's misused a lot in the United States. And so the United States especially is very reckless in the way that it goes about the IVF process. So other countries, for example, have regulations on IVF that allow for potentially less embryos to be made initially, so that way there's not as much surplus, so that the loss of embryo and the loss of life is mitigated more, where the United States currently does not have regulations. So that's why you do hear these stories of couples making 10 or more embryos at a time, because there is a cost involved. So, it doesn't matter, you pay the same amount of money per cycle of IVF, whether you make 1 embryo or you make 10. So then, of course, why would couples, just choose the 1 if they can get 10, with that same money that they pay? But the problem is, again, this idea that now we're into this whole other dilemma, because again, if you believe this is life, then now you have all this life that's made, and ethically all that life should be given the chance. And so I want to make sure that clear, it's like it's inherently not evil, and there are more ethical ways of doing IVF. So for example, the doctor who works for the NEDC is a fertility doctor himself. He has his own fertility clinic that he does outside of the NEDC, and his method of doing IVF for couples is to, instead of freezing embryos, he freezes the sperm and egg separately, and then they make 1 or 2 embryos at a time, and transfers whatever they make at a time. And so that again would be the more ethical way of undergoing IVF versus what the process is now. And again, even with that, there's still a risk that that embryo doesn't make it. But again, you're talking about less life and the less chance of that happening. And so I just want the big thing is for people to again think and research this. There's one other part of IVF too that I want to address, and it's the idea of eugenics. And so this idea of eugenics is a term given to say, trying to put value and more or less value on embryos for certain reasons. So one of the ways that IVF is also improperly and unethically used is that when couples make embryos in IVF, they can have those embryos genetically tested as an embryo to tell about this embryo certain features about it. So you can test and find out what gender the embryo is, whether it's a boy or girl. You can tell if there's any potential for genetic markers of disease in the future. So they can, test for things like trisomies or things like that that could be uh, the embryo could have. And so one of the biggest problems with IVF, and you don't have to go through that testing, but it has been used in that way in the United States to where couples may say, I only want to have a boy, so I'm going to make 10 embryos and we're going to test to figure out how many of those are boys. And then we're going to choose those embryos that are boys to transfer and not choose the girls because we want a boy. Or it could be the other way, or it could be, couples have multiple miscarriages and they suspect that it's because of some kind of genetic thing going on underlying those embryos. And so they may say, we keep miscarrying. We really want to have the best chance to have a baby that's not going to miscarry. So we're going to test our embryos. And the ones that don't have any potential genetic markers, the ones that are genetically the best, are the ones we're going to transfer. And then and in a lot of these cases, they never transfer the others. And so the problem is, again, from an ethical standpoint, especially Christian ethics, is now you're putting more or less value on life based off those things, where ultimately all those embryos should have an equal chance of life regardless. And so there is a problem where nowadays people start using IVF to shop for embryos, or they again play God in the sense of, I'm going to bring about the baby that I want, even though it was never meant to be that way. It was always meant to be in God's hands, that regardless of if you had a boy or girl, regardless of if your baby had a genetic marker or not, that was never people's choice ever. The baby you have is the baby that you get to raise. And so there's a big moral and ethical issue when you get to that level as well with IVF. And sadly, a lot of couples will do that. And the problem is, like I said, all embryos should have the chance. And so the NEDC, when we go through and look at embryos that are on their donor list, they don't disclose any information about those embryos. You don't know if they're going to be boy or girl. They do know that some of those embryos were genetically tested. And so if there is potentially a marker to those embryos, there is a separate category for couples who feel led to adopt those embryos. You could choose to adopt an embryo with a marker, and it's a little less cost to do that. But again, the thing about the NEDC is they really want to value the life of those embryos. They want to give each embryo the equal opportunity and chance as they can. And one sweet thing too about the NEDC that we didn't mention is that Jenni talked about, this grading that they give the embryos. So that an embryologist, when they thaw the embryos, they have to look under a microscope to see first, is there any cell that has life in that? Because if there's not, then again, it didn't make it through the thaw. But this idea of a grading, it's a very subjective grading. So not every embryologist has the same criteria for what marks a good, fair or poor grading on an embryo. But every one of those gradings has a chance at life. And they really value that if there's even one single living cell in that embryo that they can see, they will give that embryo a chance at life. And they have had embryos successfully become babies that were given a poor grading. And so that grading should never be used to necessarily be a huge weight in choosing embryos. And one last thing I'll say too is they're really their value of life goes to the point that the embryos that don't make it through the thaw for these transfers, they actually will donate those embryos to an organization that has a memorial for those embryos. So even those embryos that are lost,
And a burial.
and they have an official ceremony to even grieve, but then again recognize the life of those embryos that didn't make it. So again, a lot of what we talk about here really comes down to that foundation that you do have to see and believe. And again, this isn't just a Christian point; it's a scientific fact that these embryos are a human at the early stages of life and our life and deserve all the life that every person deserves.
Yeah. I appreciate you sharing that. The whole aspect about choosing embryos based on their genetics and selecting them off sex, hair color, testing for all it's really chilling because it sounds like it's something straight out of the book Brave New World, where in the beginning they're putting people based on their genetics in these categories. And yeah, that's really chilling to me. I want to ask two more questions because I know we got to wrap up.
Okay.
Jenni, you were talking about loving Silas more than you previously thought you'd be capable of through, adoption and things like that. Which I was just, as you were speaking about that, I just got this picture of, the gospel and how, as believers in Christ, we are adopted sons and daughters who were, um, we
Hmm.
we were we didn't belong to the Father, and now we do, and we're loved in a special way through Christ and His redemptive work. How has adoption shaped your view of the gospel and in like those real terms?
Yeah, yeah, it's a great miniature picture of the gospel. Um, he was once not our son, now he's our son. Just like how we were once not God's children, now we are. I think, even to a bigger extent, like Silas was never our enemy, right? Like I didn't have to die to save him. But knowing that we have a savior who we were his enemies and he died to save us and he loves us. So I think it just magnifies even like Christ's love even more. Um, and, I think there's definitely parallels, but it just makes me rejoice even more in the love that Christ has shown to us.
Yeah, that's awesome. My last question is, are you guys planning on growing your family anymore?
And yeah,
Oh, yeah.
yes, we so obviously that was something we had to consider after having Silas and deciding then, okay, what's the future for our family? And so we had never gotten pregnant before Silas, and so we had no guarantees that we'd get pregnant after because there was nothing when we went through our fertility testing, there was nothing physically that was keeping us from getting pregnant. So it really was the Lord's will that He just was, and we see now, obviously after the fact, that it was God's will that our family would start with adopting Silas all along. And so that's a really sweet reality when you think of it. We've been married for almost 7 years, and Silas has been frozen for 10. So really, when you look at God's sovereignty, He had chosen for Silas to be our baby before we ever even met. And so that still gives me goosebumps to this day, and how God's love and redemption really was working out even before Jenni and I ever met. And so when it came to deciding, okay, what do we do from here? We decided to just try to have continue to try naturally again, just because we didn't want to not try if we still were struggling. And God blessed us with a natural child of our own. So Jenni, actually, she's 9 months pregnant right now with a boy of our own, and that we, in Lord willing, in 8 days we'll get to see. And so, because we have a C-section scheduled, and so it's been really sweet because you when we tell our story and we talk about having a natural child now, a lot of people are like, yeah, we hear that all the time. Couples who adopt, then get pregnant on their own, and a lot of that is really comes down to the fact that when you go through infertility, there's a lot of stress that you go through when you're really trying to get pregnant. Things aren't working out. There is added anxiety stress that does have physical impact on the body. And so a lot of times couples who adopt, get pregnant naturally because now that stress is gone. And so I do think that's part of it, but I also think in our situation, and for couples who do embryo adoption, is Jenni actually also physically went through a pregnancy. And so I do believe that it, reset her hormones, and that her body was actually more prepared then to get pregnant naturally. But again, either way, we don't know. But by God's grace, He has blessed us with a child of our own now, And so we don't know what the future is going to look like. We're always open to embryo adoption because, again, it's such a sweet, sweet way to adopt a baby. But yeah, God has blessed us now with a natural child, and Silas and this boy Wesley will be 13 months apart. And yes, their stories will be very different, but they will still know each other as brothers. And I think, again, that picture of the gospel is God makes a family who are not a family. And so our family, like some couples who adopt and stuff, is going to be a little blended and a little unique, but it's still such a testimony to his grace and goodness. And we still absolutely trust that he will guide us and how to, if our family will continue to grow. But it is a blessing to be able to now welcome another baby who, will be our genetics. So I think that's actually kind of a unique thing too, is um, even though Silas does, look a lot like us in many ways, we still know that he's not genetically ours. And so it's actually kind of funny that now Jenni and I with this baby are actually interested to be like, okay, this baby is going to be genetically ours and may, actually look like us. And so it's just a sweet thing. But either way, we love them both so much, and we're excited to kind of see how they get to interact and grow. And Silas will always know his story. It's something that the NEDC requires of all couples who adopt. You agree that you will tell your baby that they were adopted. That's not something that should ever be withheld, but sometimes some couples may feel that way. But so Silas will still know, and Wesley will know Silas's story, and our hope and goal is that it can be something, again, worth celebrating, not to be met by any shame, not to be this thing that's kept secret, but be able to say, like, no, this is a testimony to God's goodness, and we want to share that story.
What a beautiful story, guys. It's just I can't help but smile. Obviously I knew the answer to your question about because we know each other personally and we're friends. But I think it's just a beautiful thing for people to hear, and it might inspire others, and well, it will inspire others. I know that for a fact. But just I'm just so grateful to, on a personal level, to, be your guys' friend and brother in Christ. And, it's been amazing to watch your guys' faithfulness as you've been on this journey. And so thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for sharing it publicly and being bold and taking your story and what God has given you guys to use it for his glory ultimately. And so we'll be praying for this next little child, that he comes into the world safely and healthy, and may the Lord bless you guys richly.
Thank you so much for having us on. This was fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe we can do it again sometime.
Yeah, sounds good.
We'll see you guys. Bye.
Bye.